Hi everyone, and welcome to Musings of a Jesus Lover. I'm Mark Kretschmar, and today we are going to talk about the reliability of this document, the Bible. Everything in Christianity, all the beliefs, all the doctrines, the things we believe, the things we say, have to be rooted in here, or else people are just making it up. So why in the world should we believe anything that is written in this? Well, let's just talk about the New Testament today. Why should we believe anything written in a book 2,000 years old? And today's conversation is not a spiritual one. It is an academic one. We're going to talk about the science of how ancient documents are determined to be reliable or not. It's a process called textual criticism. And you can Google that yourself if you want to look that up and see how that works. But in essence, it's this. For any ancient document, they look and see how many copies of it do we have so that they can compare those copies. And how old are they? What kind of time gap exists between the events they describe and the oldest document that we have? And there's a great example from a guy named Greg Kukul. I'm not sure who he is. I just found this article online. And he gives this great example of a recipe. Okay, let's say my Aunt Minnie had this great recipe for chocolate chip cookies. I really did have an Aunt Minnie. And it was just spectacular. So everybody in the family wanted a copy. So she had the original, and then 10 people, her kids and nieces and nephews all got a copy. So there are 10 copies there. And these were so good that all their friends wanted copies. So each one of them gave copies to friends. So there's like 30 copies at this like third tier. And then somehow or other Aunt Minnie loses the original. So she calls the people she gave them to. They've all lost them as well. Nobody knows where these things are. The only copies we can find are the ones from that third tier. These are copies of copies. We've got about 30 of them. So we look at them, we start comparing them. Turns out that 26 of the 30 are absolutely identical. One of them has more chocolate chips than the other. Two of them invert the instructions someplace, telling you which pieces to put in first as you're mixing it together. And the other one doesn't mention what temperature to bake it at all. Do you suppose that given these documents, we can construct a reliable version of what we believe the original was? Well, sure we can. It's easy amongst 30, when 26 are in complete agreement, to spot the outliers and say, no, these are not part of the original. We can tell because these are all the same. Well, that's the process of textual criticism. So let's look at some ancient documents that historians have complete faith in, that they absolutely believe. Most of the ones I'm going to list here, are about the Roman Empire. And most of what we know about the Roman Empire is in these documents. There are some others, of course, but these are kind of the big heavy hitters. One's called the Annals of Imperial Rome by Tacitus. There are two partial manuscripts that exist. You have to put them together to get an entire document. The oldest one is more than 1,000 years after the things it's describing. Thucydides wrote something called History. There are 8 copies of that, the oldest of which is still 1,000 years after what it describes. Caesar's Gallic Wars, 10 copies, more than 1,000 years past the events that it's actually describing. Herodotus wrote something called a History as well. There's 8 copies, more than 1,000 years past the actual events it's describing. A few other examples of what are considered to be reliable ancient texts is the Jewish War by Josephus, a Jewish historian. There are 9 copies. Plato has his writings. There's 7 copies of that, more than 1,000 years. Homer's Iliad is kind of an exception to all this. There are 647 copies of that. Still more than 1,000 years past the original date. These documents are not really questioned. What we know about the Roman Empire comes from these documents. That's the number of copies we have, and that's how old they are. the New Testament. Let me get the number right. In 1980, they did a study, and they determined there were 5,366 manuscripts of this document. You want to see that in a chart? Here's what we know about the Roman Empire. It doesn't even show up on this chart because there's 8 or 10, some of them only 2. Here's the Iliad starting to show up a little bit. Here's the New Testament. And in addition to that, the copies we do have of the New Testament, some are as old as only 100 years after the events they describe. 100, 200 years, maybe 300. There's just a ton of them in that range. There's nothing like the documents we have that describe the Roman Empire, and yet we believe those things. No one questions that. If you want to say, you know what, I don't think Nero was really an oppressive, cruel leader of Rome. Great. What do you got for evidence? Because the evidence that we have says he was. No one questions that. And if you want to question that and make an argument for it, you're going to have to produce some sort of older document, more reliable document. You got to have some way to come up with that. Here is the New Testament. Several authors recording Jesus' life, what he did, what he said, and recording the Acts of the Apostles, what they did right after Jesus was gone and how they went forth into the world. And then all these letters written by Paul and Peter and James and John, just elaborating on the teachings of Jesus. Overwhelming evidence, by the way we measure ancient documents, that these were real people. They really said these things. And there are no conflicting documents from the time where somebody said, hey, I was there, it didn't happen that way. There's no documents like that. So when this claims that Jesus fed 5,000 out of a basket of a couple of fish and a couple of loaves of bread, you don't believe that? What do you got? We've got eyewitnesses that recorded it in the most reliable ancient document on the planet. Jesus said that no one comes to the Father but through him, because he is the way, the truth, and the life. Well, I don't believe Jesus said that. All right, what do you got? We got this that says he did. What sort of evidence can you produce to suggest that he didn't say that? This even goes to Jesus rising from the dead. There's a book on this subject by Greg Boyd called Jesus, Lord or Legend. And it goes in and just describes all of these things in detail about that. And, well, maybe it's just a legend that developed over time. And he just refutes all those things. But that's not our topic. We're not going to go into whether Jesus rose from the dead. But we will say that the people that wrote this, 4 different accounts, and really even the writings after it, all attest to the fact that he did, that they saw it with their own eyes. If you want to believe he didn't, well, you've got to have some sort of argument for that that outweighs this. So, it's interesting. I don't believe in Jesus because I believe in God. I was an atheist for many years. A devoted one at that. But through this kind of process, I find out that Jesus is a real historical figure, and that there's overwhelming evidence that this really is what he said and this really is what he did. Suddenly he becomes an extremely believable character. And if he said these things and did these things, well, then he must be who he said he was. So now I believe in God. Not the other way around. You can't argue the existence of God. It's too complicated. You can argue it, but you can't come to the conclusions. But I can solidly argue for the existence of Jesus and for the reality and the reliability of the things that he said. And that takes me to the place where, well, then God must be real, because that's who sent him and that's who he talked about. So that's textual criticism. This is why we rely on this document, and that's why we can rely on it. It's why, if you're like me, if you're a skeptic and you think, well, how can people believe all that stuff? Well, then this is the answer. And when you read this thing through and actually know what it says, it's coherent. It makes sense altogether. And that gets us into the area of interpretation. Well, okay, it says these things. These people really wrote that. How are we supposed to interpret that? It's another question. We'll handle that next time. But this time, textual criticism. Most reliable ancient document on the planet. That's why we believe this stuff. If you would, click like and share, that kind of stuff. That would just be awesome. I would really appreciate that. Leave a comment. Argue with me. Tell me how wrong I am if you'd like. I'm fine with that. Just be kind. And we'll see you next time.